Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm Liz Kay. As we approach the end of 2021, let's revisit a conversation that resonated with many podcast listeners. Our episode with Dr. Mabel Abraham of the class of 2003 and Dr. Tristan Botelho of the class of 2007. Abraham and Botelho were first-generation students when they enrolled at Providence College, and despite that challenge, found success in academia. Let's listen. Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Kay, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. Here in the Providence College Podcast, we bring you interesting stories from the Friar family. This week, we're literally highlighting a family. We're talking with Dr. Mabel Abraham of the class of 2003 and Dr. Tristan Botelho of the class of 2007. These siblings have a lot in common. They both graduated from PC. They both earned doctorates from MIT's Sloan School of Management, and now they both teach at Ivy League institutions. Abraham teaches at Columbia University and Botelho is at Yale. There's another unique fact about these two. They were both first-generation college students, meaning they were the first in their family to graduate from college. We're excited to talk to them as National First Generation College Celebration Day approaches on November 8th. Mabel and Tristan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
So maybe we could just start at the very beginning. What brought you both to Providence College? Mabel, maybe you should go first since you were the first.
Yeah, as the first one, maybe I'll jump off. It's interesting because when I often tell the story, when I think about my path to PC or my path to higher education, I have sort of a limited lens, and that I think it starts getting into the factors of being a first generation college student. I was thinking about where I applied, and I applied to 4 schools. So I applied to PC, to Boston College, to URI, and to Bryant. And I think it's funny now thinking back on it because I didn't really have a broader perspective on what else I should be thinking about. So my decision to go to PC was partly that I knew I didn't want to go far from home. Another thing that I think first generation college students often experience, I wanted to stay relatively close. It felt harder to go farther away. I got great financial support from PC, another important factor, again, specifically thinking about first generation college students. And at the time I was thinking about pursuing biology science, thinking pre-med. And thought it was attractive that there was a program between PC and Brown that potentially gave me a pathway to end up going to Brown for med school. So those were the driving factors. But since I know we have a broad audience base that will be listening to this, I think sort of my advice in thinking back on that is that I should have looked much broader. There are so many schools, and PC ended up being great for me. But for someone else who might not have landed in the place where they'd like to be, had I made that consideration set a bit bigger, it would have just been a safer way to go.
And you both grew up in East Providence, right?
Correct.
Correct, yeah.
Because we definitely have today, first generation students who come to PC from all over the country, Texas, California, many people are making that choice, but like choosing PC as their destination school. So that's really interesting advice, Mabel. And Tristan, how did you find Providence College?
Yeah, so it was interesting when I think back to that moment. Mabel was in college while I was applying to college. And, one thing about the age difference that's, always been helpful is seeing her kind of set, various examples along the way has been useful, but also our closeness in age, even though she's, 3.5 years older, meant that it was really hard to distill information that quickly. So I remember, even applying to schools. And I don't know at 21 years old if you've figured it out enough to give anyone advice that's that concrete, right? I think now, and maybe 5 years ago, I could start giving people really thoughtful advice about how we should think about the process, the pros and cons. But if someone asked me as a junior in college, hey, how should I think about college? I'd probably say, oh, I'm having a lot of fun here. Right, there's not that much information that can be given. So the approach was very similar. A handful of schools, got into most of them. But, one thing that's just a fact, I think, of most first gen students, regardless of the city, state you come from, if you are from an immigrant family like ours or not, is finances are usually top of mind. And PC gave a great mix of merit scholarship and financial aid that it just wouldn't have been feasible otherwise. When we think about a return on investment, I'm thinking about other options that I had. When you looked at maybe the US News rank, you'd say wow, you didn't go there. But it's yeah, but it would have cost $40,000 per year. Whereas at the time, at PC, when we put all of the kind of the scholarship and the financial aid together, we were talking about an amount much, much less than that. So I think that, it's an important thing for all students, I'm sure. Everyone's always kind of watching their bank account, but for first gen students in particular, it's something that has to be top of mind. So what we're trying to do is you're trying to find this really nice combination of like a rigorous education that seems like you'll have a good time and meet, great friends, but also one that you can afford. And Providence offered that. Like I knew, having, been a Friar fan my entire life, the basketball team and things of that nature, I knew it'd be a lot of fun. And that played out. My two random roommates were both at my wedding party. So like that's the kind of relationship I got to build while being there. And I knew from Mabel's experience that she learned a lot of interesting things, had, good internship opportunities. So I thought like, okay, they're checking off that box as well. I can't really justify taking on a massive amount of debt for, 20 or 30 ranks on the U.S. News College list. Not that I put much, I don't subscribe much to that kind of ranking to begin with, but, those are the decisions that I think like a 17-year-old is thinking through. And when you don't have, when we say first gen students, Mabel was literally the first in terms of aunts, uncles, cousins. It's not just in the family of four that we grew up, and I was second. So it's like, you can't just pick up the phone, and call someone and be like, hey, like, how should I think about this? So it really relied on us kind of doing our own research, and not to date us, but I guess you did it with our class year. The internet was around and we had the internet, in full use, but the information you could get back then was much, much different in terms of how we should be thinking about it. I still got brochures in the mail when I was applying to schools, and I filled out some applications by hand. So so that's kind of, the long-winded short of it, of how, Providence was the choice that I made.
I was going to add one. Tristan said something that I think like really hits the nail on the head about the updating and processing of information. It's really interesting to reflect on this today, and this certainly isn't the first time I thought about this as far as what are the unique challenges or what are the things that shaped my path as a first generation college student. But I feel like by the time I realized what I could have done differently, it is no exaggeration to say that it's like 10 years later. And like another example of that just came to mind as I was hearing him describe is I remember getting to PC and learning that people had practiced for the SAT. They had like taken Kaplan courses. My mind was literally blown. I was like, oh my goodness, I sat for the SAT twice and I improved my score marginally. And I maybe at the time did look up something online that I thought would be beneficial, but had zero knowledge of what I needed to do better. So I feel like all of those kinds of things, all of those kinds of lessons come just a little too late. And you're not distilling how those pieces fit together to shape your path. Of course, you highlighted how Tristan and I are now teaching in Ivy League schools. So it all worked out and it's all great. And I'm grateful for every stepping stone along the way. But all of those different steps were more challenging because I simply lacked the knowledge or the resources to be able to figure out how to give myself a leg up. And I think that's a constant thing that I know I face from applying to school, literally through graduating from my PhD, and sometimes still deal with it in my current job, but definitely less now. So I think the fact that knowledge just comes a little too late and you don't know where to look for it is one of the biggest challenges, really.
And to give a quick example, her mind was so blown about the prep courses is that she never even told me about it. So
I had so much to tell her. I mean, there was so much that like it was hard to know what was important.
So can we talk a little bit about your family and like how they were able to help or support you? I mean, how did they feel about you making the decision? You two were really pioneers for your family and sounds on multiple generations to take this plunge into higher education. What were your parents and all of the extended family? How did they react and support you as they could through this journey?
So it's really interesting because I think when I think about the common challenges that face first generation college students, the way I organize them in my mind, at least, is there are two categories. The one category is what we've already talked a little bit about, which relates to like a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding of how things work or what you can do to sort of advance your position. The second category that you hear a lot about is family struggles that come from tensions often with I'm climbing out of this position and I'm going to get my education, get a college degree, but no one else has, and how that can place some tension. I think, and I'll let Tristan sort of speak for himself, but I think that we would both agree that we were very, very lucky that our challenges were predominantly in that first category. It was a lack of knowledge, but it wasn't tension stemming from our family. It's incredible to me thinking back at how supportive my parents really were. They recognized, despite not having an education themselves, they recognized the value of education. And specifically, even when we were very young, recognized the value of us not only doing well in school, but then going to college and getting a degree, and ideally getting an advanced degree. That they had that insight and sort of distilled that information from such a young age. My parents had me when they were 22, so they were very young themselves. Blows my mind. Like, it's just like such an incredible thing that we had that gift. Like they couldn't tell us how to do it, but they definitely were there telling us to do it and encouraging us to figure it out, and supporting us along the way. So I feel like from that tension perspective, we didn't really have it. I think there's sometimes like internal struggles with extended family where you start thinking like, oh, my older cousins didn't go to school, and do they think that I'm elitist? And even if it isn't actually true, right? Often these things are unfounded. I think there's some of that, and I definitely experienced some of that, where I just at least self-imposed these perspectives that, oh, does my aunt or does my cousin think that I think I'm better than them, or I'm doing something? And that's not at all the case, but it definitely is a part of the struggle. And I think that sort of speaks to that second category. But from an immediate nuclear family perspective, 100%, I feel like my parents supported us and financially supported us, which I think is another way that a lot of first generation college students don't have that benefit. My dad worked 2 jobs our entire childhood, and my mom stayed home and took care of us. So they both, from my perspective, worked equally hard, just in very different ways. So I think that the fact that they were willing to do that and make those sacrifices so that, sure, we couldn't afford to go to the $40,000 a year school, like that wasn't reasonable or doable for our family, but my parents did contribute in every way that they could, working as much as they needed to make it happen. So I consider us very lucky that we basically faced the lack of knowledge challenge, but had all the support that we needed.
Yeah, I think that was great. I wouldn't, have much to add. Our parents are always extremely supportive of every decision we make, be it seemingly rational or irrational, as long as it comes from a good place. And they instilled in us, the necessary drive to be kind, work hard, and be thankful. And that carries on through both of us every single day. That, you should be very thankful for the position that you're in, be proud of the work that you do, and be kind to those people you meet along the way. And that's something that sticks with us, I think, in our regular interactions, and gives us the ability throughout our lives to, try really hard. Because like Mabel said, they stress the importance of education. They stress the importance of, thinking big and not, shying away from challenges. It was never the case of kind of taking the easy road or doing something because, there's less frictions. It was always about, do you want to do this? How does it make you feel? And, really embracing that, which I think is hard to do. Like a good example of that is even like choosing a career as an academic. My goal was actually to go straight through undergrad. It was actually, professors at Providence who, brought up this really good point around, you could work for a few years, given the kind of things you want to do research on are very organizational, very kind of finance or strategy related at the time, whatever it was that I was kind of interested in. And then you could decide to go to academia. And, my first job out of college was as an investment banker, which is, hopefully less rare now for alums. But at the time, there was almost no one in the alumni network who had done that whatsoever. And when I told them, that was still a dream of mine to, go into academia, you really have to love your kid for them to tell you that they're going to throw away like a well-paying career to go make, $30,000 as a PhD student. And like, they were all for it. And that's the support they've always given us, regardless of what we've decided to do. And I think that that's the most important thing, because if you have that like network of people who will be your biggest cheerleaders, but also be willing to, check you if you're wrong, that's how you get ahead, and that's how you get things done. So they've always been there in that capacity, even now as adults with kids of our own, helping us along the way, which is always something that we appreciate.
Tristan's example just made me think of how I mentioned that when I started, I thought I was going to go into medicine. And it's not like just by chance that I thought medicine. It's really because when you're a first generation college student, very often you can't identify what careers will basically check off the necessary boxes of being relatively high status, right? There's something about if I'm in a prestigious job, I've sort of made it. Will give you a livable wage where you can live comfortably and have a good income. And like that the educational component aligns with your abilities and aptitudes. So it sort of checked those boxes for me. And even at the very beginning, when I was applying to school, I remember my parents saying, like, I don't know, like, I can't see you as a doctor. Like, I can't see you being comfortable in like medical school and sort of see in an operating room. Like, those things just don't align with who you are as a person, but they supported it. They were like, if that's what you think you want, you should do it. And even that, and again, thinking back, it's really interesting for an immigrant family to then tell their child that this prestigious job, to not just be like, yes, go for it, this is what you should do, but to actually try to create those checks and balances and saying, I know you, and you're emotional when you see someone like fall and hurt their knee. Like, how are you going to handle being a pediatrician or dealing with sick kids? But they were willing to sort of pull back and encourage me to then pursue a degree in math, where I didn't know what the application of math would be. I didn't have a clear path forward, but they wanted me to do something I was excited about, interested in, and that they thought I would be good at and that I would enjoy, even if the path forward wasn't super clear to them. So that, is very similar to the story Tristan shared about thinking about a high paying career. But even as a student, they're like, no, you love math, do it. Like, you'll figure out the career later. Like, don't worry about that.
That is fantastic support and very generous and intuitive. They knew you both really well, it seems like. Tristan, what was your ambition when you started college? What did you foresee doing in the future when you got started? And you have kind of an interesting pairing of undergraduate majors. You were history and finance.
It's interesting because I was history, finance, took a bunch of math and stats class as well. And, I'm still like, if my bookshelf is only like halfway visible here, if you look at it, it's like, what does this guy do even? It's a mixture of like math and stats books, history books, like poetry, philosophy. I just, have always been interested, which I think can get you a lot of trouble, early on in college, right? Because if you just stay interested, you have to pick something that you want to major in or get an internship in. So the history part of it is just kind of an initial passion of mine. Like always, was kind of obsessed with early American history, Greek history, and just, fascinated by it as a kid. And so I went to Providence. I knew that part of my identity would have to remain just because it's something that I'm genuinely interested in. When it comes to finance, quite honestly, it goes back to what Mabel was saying in terms of being a first generation college student. It plays a large theme. I remember meeting with my career development. I don't know if they still do this, but in your first term or second term, you'd meet with career development and they would just talk to you about careers. And I remember asking the woman at the time who was the director, I forget her name, that was assigned to me. I just asked her point blank. I said, what is one of the more high paying jobs an undergraduate could get? And they said, well, like working in finance is going to be it. And then she talked about investment banking. And I went home and I remember, so we're back to my room. I remember searching it and seeing that, it was always on the list of, high paying jobs. And I had bought stocks beforehand. It was like interested in the market as like a mechanism, but not really, interested in, let's say, any part of finance. So that was it. I said, okay, if that's going to be something that is seemingly interesting, it's kind of competitive, which I enjoy, and it's high paying, I'm just going to get it. And that's going to be the job. So I added on the major of finance for that purpose. It sounds quite practical, but that's exactly what it was at the time. I think that's kind of what my thinking was in terms of, I knew like just being a history major had some clear outs, right? People went to law school, people did other interesting jobs, but it was more limited. And then if this is true that, these jobs in finance that I knew less about were kind of prestigious, high paying, then that made sense. So, I added that on. And it was really in my junior year when I started doing research that I was, kind of head over heels with academia and doing that as a career. And it wasn't until, like I said before, advisors I had that said, hey, hold on, you could always do that a little later. Like you have, a really high GPA, you have, you've taken classes, like you could really get one of these jobs. So why don't you try that first? And through, networking and a little bit of trickery, I was able to kind of land those kinds of jobs. And it was lots of fun. I learned a lot through them, met a lot of interesting people, but it was always in the back of my mind, hey, you've always wanted to do this other thing. And I've always kind of, tried to follow kind of my passion and the stuff that I, feel strongly about. And that's what made me end up leaving to go back and get a graduate degree. That's
interesting because you both went back to get graduate degrees, and sounded like, Tristan, like your idea about entering academia started kind of in college. How about you, Mabel? When did you think, you also graduated with a math major and then worked in the financial services sector, right? Like after graduation. So what made you take a turn and decide to go back for your degree?
So it's interesting. I didn't have quite how Tristan's describing. Like I didn't have that deep-seated thought that I would go into academia as an undergrad. I sort of flirted with the idea during my senior year but at the time, what I thought I would do is pursue a PhD in math. But what I also knew at that time was that I was not loving the more abstract, like as we got into real analysis, the more abstract math wasn't as enticing to me. So I talked to some of my advisors about pursuing a PhD in statistics. We talked about it, and we sort of thought through the possibilities, but I wasn't bought in. I wasn't sure if that was just like, it seemed like an obvious next thing to do with a degree in math, or if it actually was what I wanted to do. So I ended up discovering the path of actuarial science. So basically a different application of math, and very similar. I remember my advisor saying, why don't you work for a couple of years and get some applied math experience in the field? And if you have this interest, like it's always a possibility down the line as well. But if he wasn't, I don't think he was convinced that I really wanted to pursue a PhD in statistics. So I ended up working at Fidelity initially as an actuary and taking a number of the actuarial exams, and very quickly realizing that I wasn't that interested in that. And the things, looking back, the things that I didn't love about that job was that it was, especially as an early career person, really independent work where you didn't have a lot of interaction with other people. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm quite a social person and want to be having conversations most of the time. And it didn't really align with my personality. So I explored a couple of different jobs at Fidelity. I ended up staying with Fidelity for 5 years. And during that time, I became really fascinated by some of the social dynamics at work. And that's where my initial interest on studying gender inequality and thinking about gender came into play. I realized really small things, like some of the VPs that I respected the most that were women didn't speak up when we were in meetings with the entire team, but they were really vocal in these smaller team meetings with their subordinates. I sort of thought, like, why is that? Like, why are the women who are so powerful in some settings and not speaking up? I realized that people struggle to balance work and family situations, right? Like lots of new moms thinking about, like, how do I take leave? What does that mean for my career down the line? So as I sort of had these different exposures in the workplace, I started wondering, like, where could I study? Like, what would a job be where I could better understand these things that I think are interesting? Like, what job would that even be? And I thought about sociology. I thought maybe a degree in sociology would be like an understanding of these structures and how the world works. And I remember having conversations with Tristan at the time, actually sitting in my parents' backyard with all of these kind of ideas floating around, and him, I believe, suggesting that I look at PhD programs in management, but essentially like thinking about work-life questions and taking this perspective and looking at these management PhDs. And that just kind of got things rolling. I remember having this binder again, because even as in 2006, 7-ish, I was like printing out different information about different programs and figuring out where I wanted to apply. Ended up applying that year and enrolling the year after. So it was sort of like a slow, and again, in hindsight, thinking about my interest in math and what I enjoyed about math was like the application and the logic that went into it. And it turns out that in my PhD program and in my career, I basically do the statistical work. I do quantitative research, answering these questions that I was only exposed to or sort of made aware of by working for a couple of years, but bringing that mathematical background to analyze data and thinking about how I can answer these questions using real world data. So it seems perfectly synergistic now. It didn't seem clear to me at the onset when I first graduated, but through my work experience, I kind of landed on this path.
And Tristan, were you always thinking you were going to get a degree, go get a doctorate in management?
Yeah, so I was actually, one thing that's interesting, I guess I'll phrase it this, one thing that's interesting about, questions that have to do with, organizations, markets as a context. There are so many interesting lenses you can take there. So I was quite open to, various viewpoints for the questions that I found interesting then, and that I, of course, find interesting now. So, when Mabel was explaining, some of the interest she had, it's because I had done research on these related programs, in the prior years, that I was very familiar with the kind of work that was going on, very interdisciplinary, very interested in questions that have both, economic but social relevance. These are impactful questions that, we've come to study, that we were both, have been interested in for quite some time. So for me, it was more about finding the fit with, individuals, like looking at faculty at different departments. What were they studying? Where were they housed? And, many of them happened to be, in management programs, organizational behavior programs, strategy programs. Like, our fields use lots of different names to mean very similar things. But, broadly speaking, that's kind of how I found the fit. But going into it, I never thought of it like quite from that perspective. I thought more of like, what are some of the questions that I find interesting? Who are studying them, and like, where do they get a PhD? And it is kind of a fun rabbit hole to go down, because some of them, did graduate from business school. Some of them graduated from more discipline-based schools like sociology, economics, psychology. So, there's various pathways for getting to a very similar place. So, that's what I really enjoy about doing this kind of research at these kinds of programs, is that it gives you the license to really try to be as well-rounded as you can in terms of perspectives when answering these questions.
Well, this is a great segue to ask you both about your research, and even to ask about some of the collaborations you've done, because I think it looks like you've done some collaborative research projects together, and very curious about what it's like to work with a colleague who is a blood relative, and if that changes the dynamic at all.
Yeah, no, I guess no offense to my other collaborators, but Mabel's my favorite collaborator for lots of reasons. But, one thing that, is always fun is that we can kind of argue with one another. She does tell on me sometimes, so that can get a little annoying. But, for the most part, we keep it between us, which is helpful. But, all jokes aside, I think, what really drives it to be such a successful partnership is the fact that, we are really, obsessed with quality, and we're obsessed with, kind of not only working hard, but having fun while doing the process. And, we're both lucky to have co-authors that share many of those same sentiments, of course, but it's, always kind of special when you can share it with someone that you know so well, that it's made it lots of fun. And I think also, funny enough, even with the sibling thing aside, being trained at obviously the same place by similar people, those collaborations also become a little more effortless, because you're coming from, a place with similar expectations, similar viewpoints, but also the diversity of your own thought, right? So it's like you share these commonalities that might make, how we think about approaching a certain question less friction than if you're doing it with someone who, may have been trained an equally good way, but just differently. So there's lots of, benefits to that. But, I guess I'm working backwards on your question, but, broadly speaking, I'm really interested in studying evaluative processes. So what that means is, individuals, organizations, it's quite natural that, we're always trying to identify the best of something, right? The best person to hire, the best idea, the best exchange partner. But these things are hard to do. There's a lot of uncertainty in them, right? It's hard to hire people. It's hard to, develop evaluative processes that are based on quality only, because unfortunately we know lots of things that shouldn't matter do matter, like race, gender, immigration status, age. There's lots of these characteristics that come into play. So, what kind of binds my research is, it's twofold. On one side of it, I'm really trying to understand, the different mechanisms that lead to biases in these evaluations, and sometimes these biases are as straightforward as, do women, get less attention? And other work, it's more about like, does the evaluation process in and of itself kind of bias things, such as, does seeing the rating of someone else affect how you yourself rate? And then another stream of work, I take a very similar approach, but looking at it from more around the context of entrepreneurship and labor markets to understand careers. Who gets hired, what happens to, former founders, for example, when they go back into the labor market. So these are some of the other questions that I'm really interested in. And, this is the kind of question that I could talk to you about for an hour, but I'll be mindful and kind of stop there and kind of happy to, dive in a little deeper on any of those topics.
Yeah, I'd echo. I feel like it needs to be said out loud that Tristan is also my favorite collaboration partner, truly. I often have that realization when I work on another project and I'm having a great experience with the person I'm working with, but I still seek his opinion or still want sort of to know his reactions. But then when we're working together, I feel like it's so synergistic because we have those alignments, but also just take these different angles and how and what we're thinking about that brings unique perspective to the questions and the work that we do together. It's also nice, he said that because we can argue, but to elaborate on that a little bit, I think what's really nice about it is that you're not filtered, right? Like when you're working with a collaborator, even a good friend, there's a filter because we're in a professional environment and we need to sort of be mindful of what we say and the person's feelings. It's not that I'm not at all mindful of his feelings, but I also will let him know exactly what I'm thinking at any given moment. It's actually what I think is the most important thing for any sibling to have a productive relationship is not to sort of like hold in things that frustrate you and being able to have those conversations. And we always have work and non-work related. It's always kind of been an open book sort of policy with us. So the thing I'd say about my research, so the work that I do really has largely focused on gender up until this point. And I sort of take two different perspectives on understanding gender dynamics. On the one hand, I think a lot about what leads to gender differences in outcomes. So like, why do men and women who are otherwise very similar have very different experiences, right? Why are women disadvantaged in hiring? So one context that I look at. In the paper that Tristan and I have together is why are women and men putting forth the same sort of quality of idea, yet women are not getting as much attention from their peers as men are? And like, what exactly is driving those differences? And that's the focus of a big body of my research. The other piece that I thought a little bit about is thinking what leads men and women to make different decisions, especially when they're considering jobs. So one argument is that the reason why women tend to be missing from some domains, like the reason why maybe women are missing from STEM, is because they're just not exploring jobs in those areas, or they're not pursuing jobs in those areas as much as men. So another body of work, I try to think about, like, under what conditions do women actually differ? Under what conditions are women less likely to pursue a given job compared to otherwise similar men? So it's sort of taking this like multidimensional approach to understand, like, what are evaluators doing to disadvantage women? And then how is that actually affecting women's choices and leading them to make different decisions than men are? So across my research, that's basically the general space that I'm in. I really try to focus on understanding like what the underlying, just going to use the word mechanisms, like what the underlying drivers of these effects are. Because I think what a lot of gender research has done to date is tell us that differences exist, right? No one's surprised to hear that women earn less than men on average. The thing is, if we're going to do something about it, we need to know why. Like, why is that the case? What is actually affecting or driving that difference? So I try to sort of take this more like fine-tuned approach to really develop an understanding of what those drivers are, what's leading to those differences. With the hope being that we can then do something about it, right? Like we can, as individuals, do something about our own choices. As organizational leaders and decision makers, we can give people tools to help them design systems that are less biased and that will be more equitable.
I think you're absolutely right. Like this, people always make the statement about the various disadvantages that women experience. I'm curious, do you have in that area where you're looking at, the choices that women make, are you seeing any? Do you have any findings, or like what are the results of some of those studies that you've been doing in terms of choices?
Yeah, so I'll highlight one recent paper that we just published. This was with a collaborator of mine at Columbia, where we basically look at when there's an identical job posting, right? So the job is the same. So it's not that the job is STEM versus I don't know, like a service position. That's the exact same job. And we wanted to understand like what leads men versus women to be attracted to an organization holding the job constant, so to speak. And what we find is that women are most interested in jobs at employers that signal fairness and equity. And it's not entirely surprising, right? If it is the case that women have been disadvantaged, we'd expect them to be more sensitized or looking for cues that tell them that working for this employer is going to be a positive experience. I'm going to be treated fairly, equitably, not differently from my male counterparts. So we basically find that women are much more attracted to these companies that have women in leadership and who make claims, public statements that they value diversity. Men, on the other hand, are most interested or most attracted to jobs at companies that focus on what they do to drive the business, like how they drive performance, and who are led by men. And it's not necessarily that they're just favoring male-led companies, it's that they're just no more interested when the company is signaling fairness because they're just less sensitized to that, right? So it's not just a preference for, it's not that men just prefer working for men, it's that they prefer working for men and they don't mind working for women. It's kind of the same, but they're not picking up on these cues about fairness, where women are much more sensitized.
So I'm curious, Mabel, earlier in our conversation, you mentioned how your first-gen experience kind of colored your experience all the way through your doctoral experience. And I kind of want to pose that question to you both, if you could think of any examples, because you were first-gen students as doctoral students as well. And if you could think of any anecdotes or times where, kind of like that Kaplan class example, where you felt like you had a light bulb go off and say, oh, wow, this is different for me.
Yeah. I know for me, I remember the first semester being in grad school, and for the first time realizing that everyone else in the room, maybe it wasn't actually everyone else, but it certainly felt like everyone else, had read rigorous academic research before and just understood things like the structure of the arguments and how these papers were formalized, and the kinds of journals that we should be thinking about. Whereas I remember reading my first academic paper and literally having no idea why things were laid out the way that they were, or some of the language that was even being used. It was like, I have to look up some of these words. I don't know what this means. And I remember talking to some of my colleagues who had gone to Ivy League undergraduate institutions, had parents who were professors, and it was more second nature to them. It's not that it wasn't hard, right? Everyone was learning and entering this new field, but there was a baseline level of understanding about what it meant to do social science research and what it meant to publish in high caliber, rigorous journals that felt like a foreign language to me, to be completely honest. And I remember it being quite inhibiting because I was very reluctant to speak up. And this is something that actually I had a very similar experience at PC early on as well, where I think that the bar to feel like I could raise my hand and say something felt very, very high. And very often, even somebody would make a comment or ask a question that I had been thinking about, but I wouldn't sort of bring myself to speaking up because I felt unsure. I felt I was probably the only one in the room who didn't know that. And I think some of that exists for everybody, right? So I think as a first year PhD student, there's some level of anxiety. I've now talked to my peers about this exhaustively. But the bar was just a little bit higher. It took a little bit more for me to ask. I spent a few more hours reading every time that we had an assignment. I revised and edited and kind of went through my work before submitting it that much more. So I feel like the effort was just higher at every turn, partly because of insecurity and partly because of actual lack of knowledge, not having had exposure to some of those things before entering grad school.
Yeah, so I think I echo a lot of that. I think that grad school for many people, especially at the doctoral level at a place like MIT, is an ice bath, right? It's a lot. They expect a lot from the get-go, and most people, I think, share a lot of those feelings. And I think few people are willing to fake it. More people are willing to fake it than to admit that they also feel that way. And that's something I didn't learn until later on towards graduation, where people were like, yeah, I didn't get what was going on either. I think what was most surprising to me is I remember, there's this, math camp that you go to that was hosted by the PhD economics program, which is usually, it's much bigger than a business school program. So they admit something in the order of like 20 to 30 people. Business schools, across all the programs, might admit something like 10 to 12. So there's maybe, most people go. So let's say there's 30 some people in the room. And so I hadn't met anyone yet. I sit down kind of just randomly. And it happened to be someone else who'd be a cohort mate and some others as well. And they were discussing kind of, this commonality of having parents as faculty members. And that, I think, is still one of the most stark things for me, is that I meet so many colleagues that won't offer it up because there's no reason just to say, oh yeah, my dad's a professor. But like once you get to know them, you realize that their parents are professors, both, sometimes just one. And it's so much more common than I ever expected, to the point that, I think it was the Times, I forget who wrote this list of, the professions that are most likely to trickle down throughout a family, and being a faculty member is one of them. And it makes sense. It's like, it's a rewarding career. It's a lot of fun. It's challenging. So I could see if you saw your parent do it. Even my 6-year-old jokes around. I went to the parent, curriculum night the other night. On one of the things she wrote, that she wanted to be a horseback rider and a professor. Maybe simultaneously, who knows? So like, I think you see this stuff, you think it's a lot of fun, right? And it's really interesting. So I'm not surprised that it happens, and good for them, because I think, like, I do laugh at both of all of our kids. Growing up on a college campus is cool. Like, to get to run around the green. She calls it her campus, and it's a fun thing to see. So I can imagine just that alone would be enough to want to do it. But like, I think that's the most stark thing, is that coming from, an extended family where, by the time I graduated, still only a handful of people had gone to college across the entire family, to these people talking about like their parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, all who are professors. It was just like, oh, wow. So this is like a whole new level of thing going on. So again, like, no one talked about it in like a strange way, or like the advantages it confers, sometimes are more obvious than others. But it was just, something that I think was, by way of my own background, was just surprising. But yeah, so that I guess that's what I would add to that discussion.
It's funny, Tristan, I know you've had this experience too. It's one of my favorite. So I'm very open and proud to share my background. So I'm will share anything. I open up every semester that I teach our MBA and PhD students. I open up by sharing this fact about myself. And I do that for a number of reasons. I do it because often you don't know that there's someone else who can relate to you and understand what it means to have the unique set of challenges and the unique set of rewards that come with being a first generation college student, right? It's amazing when you kind of go down this path and you're happy with your outcome, happy with where you land, wherever that might be. It's extremely rewarding because you feel like you earned something above and beyond just the degree, because you navigated this path and had to sort of trudge this path in some ways. But what I was going to say is, one of my favorite things is when people find out they were both siblings and they were both academics, especially people in our field who haven't sort of met both of us. It's starting to become less common now that more people know us and recognize the sibling relationship. But it used to be the case where they'd say like, oh, your so-and-so's your brother, or you guys are siblings. Your parents must be professors. And it's actually really fun to get to respond and say, no, actually, I have a great story. We're first generation college students, and my dad worked 2 jobs, and give kind of the backstory on that. And it's enlightening, I think, because the baseline expectation is most people have a family member who's a professor. If there are 2 of you, certainly your parents must be professors, right? I mean, that's obviously not the case.
Yeah, no, that is good. I've run into that a lot too. And I think it is important, to Mabel's point. I always bring up that fact about myself for various reasons. First and foremost, I'm proud of it. I think that we should all celebrate our differences, because by doing that, we can, create more inclusivity by being honest about, the hardships, that we deal with, the fun things. Like, I think that really helps people relate to you, which is one of the reasons that I do it. And also because, I was talking to someone the other day, and we were talking about being a first gen student, and, they said that it's interesting, right? If you think about 1 or 2 generations removed from us, so like my parents or my grandparents, claiming that you're a first gen student in either generations is like, yeah, most people are, as you go back, it becomes more and more common. But it's interesting, and dealing with the undergrads, and not that I deal with them too often because I mostly teach MBAs, but I've done some kind of service work more generally, and it seems to be like so much more of a rare thing that you can be, not that I'm in the same generation as an incoming undergrad, but closer to them than my parents. generation. And it's just that's something that, I feel in the room, they might, they obviously know this about themselves. They might have some questions. And I found that every time I share, I always have a few people come up to me after, like thanking me for sharing that and asking questions about certain things that I've dealt with, how I should be thinking, how they should be thinking about certain things. So I think it's a really important thing to talk about out loud, just because, it's a different viewpoint of the world. I think, uniquely to us, not only are we first generation college students, but also being the children of immigrants. It's something that is very unique. You see things and you've dealt with things a little differently. And by, making that connection to people and, helping them even like a small way is something that's always been, very important to me. And I know to Mabel, just because, again, along the way, lots of people sacrifice their time and their effort to help. So that's something I think is important, because you can't tell just by looking at either of us, that's true. And therefore, people usually don't share that maybe about themselves, especially if they feel some imposter syndrome. You can imagine being a Yale undergrad and thinking to yourself, well, I'm not going to tell anybody this about me because it's hard enough to be here as it is. So, I know that that's been appreciated, and I always appreciate, staying in touch and talking with those students.
So PC now has a formal program to help support students who are first generation students, PC1G, and there are mentors and advisors who can help students like walk through examples that some of the situations that you just described. When you think back to your own experiences, were there particular people, the faculty or staff, or even experiences or programs that helped you, even if they weren't formally for first generation students per se?
I was just going to say, I think that this emergence of programs, formal programs, is relatively new, not just at PC, but just in general. They've definitely become popularized. I think that everything that any one of us does is, like, with an expression to use, like, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like, we're sort of getting supported by everybody along the way, from direct support to indirect support. Anybody who claims they've done anything on their own is not telling a full truth, because we don't do anything on our own. I feel like as a first generation college student, that's just magnified in a lot of ways. And I think people often don't realize the way that they help, right? So sometimes it's having a conversation where someone is in tune enough to recognize that what you need is social support, and offering an ear and saying, you're dealing with this challenge, let me help you navigate this. And I can think of so many examples. I mean, from as an undergrad, relying on friends and being able to be open with classmates and roommates while I was there. In graduate school, having advisors where even when there was a family hardship or a challenge that I was facing, I remember my advisor at MIT, Roberto, saying, I'm a full service professor. And it was like, you don't just come to me when you're having a problem that has to do with the research, come to me when I can help you with anything. And he's lived to prove that to be the case over and over again. So I think the reality is recognizing that people are there to support you and seeking that out, because often we don't want to ask for help. And it's part of why I think both Tristan and I share about this background, is to help other people feel like, it's okay. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's actually something to be proud of. And how can you make that known and make your needs known more generally? Because I think a challenge first generation students face, again, thinking about imposter syndromes, for example, is that you don't want to ask for help. I think they're less likely to ask for help than are other people, because they already feel potentially inadequate or underprepared. And there's more concern about, how is it going to reflect on me if I need to ask for this? Or if I ask this question in class, what's going to be thought of me because I'm the one who doesn't know, who doesn't come in with the right knowledge? I think debunking that, and anybody who's able to help debunk that for those students, is the most effective thing. It doesn't take huge moves, like you don't have to move mountains to help students, right? It's just small things, like helping them feel like they can speak up, giving them a voice, identifying those small cues that tell you that somebody needs support. When I think about examples in my life that were most helpful, it was usually things like that. It was just small gestures and saying, it seems like you were like having a hard day today, like what's going on? Or can I help you with something? Those were usually the most impactful moments, more than anything concrete or sort of larger scale.
Yeah, so I think for me, there's been, an uncountable number of people who have helped and offered guidance and reacted to, half-baked ideas or thoughts or dreams or what have you along the way at PC and outside of PC. I'm supportive of formal programming only because I think one of the challenges that many groups face is you don't know what you don't know. Right. So I think oftentimes you can get really good reactive advice. So for example, when I ask people about graduate school or banking or about this or that other thing, they had opinions on it. But I think what, I struggled with was I just hadn't seen lots of things play out. Like I didn't know coming in to school, for example, when the banking recruiting cycle was or the consulting recruiting cycle was, how, like what was a super Saturday, like all these things that lots of kids just know. And like, oh yeah, this is what it is. Like, this is how you think about it. So oftentimes I found myself, not realizing I didn't know something until it was too late to know it, or reacting to something that, would have been nice maybe to have known a little earlier, in the career. So I think what this form of programming can do is that, especially if it's done, done well, is if you know that a student, is interested in X or Y, is instead of giving them the high level, I'm assuming something approach, starting from, base facts and saying, well, let me explain to you, like, you've never heard this before. This is how this process works. These are the players involved. This is the timeline, et cetera. Like that, if the programming is working in that way, I think is really, really helpful because it's filling in, these gaps that often come from just seeing it in the real world. Even if you're learning through osmosis, right? It's not like these people are taught at 12 years old what, it means to do A or B, but instead they see it in their kind of lived experience. And that allows them, when they're formulating their own opinions, to have this background knowledge. So like, that's what I'm hoping. I don't know much about, PC's program besides the fact that they had one because it was on some newsletter that I read a while back. But like, that's what I'm hoping is coming from this programming, is really trying to kind of fill in those gaps.
I know about the program because I'm a mentor and I do serve as as part of that team, but it's a pretty robust program to help answer the needs of the growing number of students who identify this way, which is great. So this year, the college is also celebrating 50 years of women, the 50th anniversary of women enrolling as undergraduates. And to celebrate, we're honoring the achievements of women faculty, students, and alumni. But we're also asking everyone who comes on the podcast, all the women who come on the podcast, Mabel, do you think your gender affected your experience at Providence College? And if so, how?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I feel like whether you identify as male or female, your gender shapes how you experience everything, right? It's sort of like this baseline identity that you have that just orients your thinking about, like, what do people like me do, right? So even if it's not overt, or if it's not like the institution or the job or the school affecting you directly, that women tend to do things like X and men tend to do things like Y. So you come in with these priors about what is the right field for a woman to go into. One of the first moments I remember thinking about my gender was when I decided to switch from science to math. And it was interesting because in my science classes, it was pretty balanced, actually, male, female. And I now think about it, I think it's because people taking the biology courses, for example, include people who are going to go into veterinary science, and it's sort of fields that are actually more female dominated. When I went into my math classes, however, it was almost all male. There were very, very few women, so much so that the couple of us who ended up in these like advanced math classes towards the end of the program became good friends because there were just a couple of us. So I do think that it was my first lens into how it can feel very challenging. I was talking about how it sometimes feels hard to ask questions or to speak up. I think that's magnified even more when you're one of the few like you in the room. So I repeatedly had that experience where in my math classes, I felt like the men tended to be louder and more vocal and more willing to contribute. And it sort of made it even more difficult for the women who maybe felt a little more insecure and were in the minority to have their opinions be heard. I always respected and liked the professors who picked up on that. And it was very clear that they picked up on that by cold calling and kind of forcing you to speak up, which can be uncomfortable, but it also just put you in a position where you didn't have to have that filter or do all of that processing. You were then the one who was being asked for the answer, and that was really helpful. So I think that the most sort of pronounced way for me is, and that kind of shapes what the research is that I do now, is this consideration of it really has an impact on you when you're in a field or in an area or in a class where you're in the gender minority. And I think a parallel there is if you're in the racial minority, a similar experience, I would imagine. And it sort of has shaped my research in thinking about, well, then we really need to understand like what leads women to be in these different fields and how do inequities manifest differently when you're in an area like in finance as opposed to in the humanities? Like how do these inequities differ across these different fields? Because there's something about the numerical representation that definitely is a factor.
Mabel and Tristan, it really has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining us for our final podcast in 2021. Episodes are available in all the usual places, as well as the college's YouTube channel and on your smart speaker. With producer Chris Judge, I'm Liz Kay. Until next time.